Welcome to a new episode of the Cota Podcast. Today with me we have Loris Degioanni. Loris and I are friends since a long time. We met in San Francisco in 2012. I just moved to San Francisco and he was, here. He's been here for a few years at that point. Loris was just about to create a new company, which then was renamed Sysdig. And Sysdig today is a pretty big company. They raised a large amount of money. They have hundreds of people working for them. But we're going to get there in a second. But before that, let me welcome Loris to the show. Thanks for being with us, Loris.
Thank you, Simone. I must say that it's strange and refreshing for the first time, probably, for me to record a podcast or something where somebody really pronounces my name correctly.
Yeah, I know.
First time it happens to me.
You can guess that I have the same issue. My Simone is one of the most difficult things to say for non-Italian speakers. We're both from Italy, if the audience has not picked it up yet. And we're both living in California at the moment. I'm in San Francisco. Loris is nearby. So Loris, tell us a bit about before Sysdig, before you came here to California. You grew up in Italy, you studied engineering in Turin, but then you co-created a tool that pretty much every developer, every technologist, every Linux administrator, every network administrator has heard of at least a few times in their lifetime. Tell us about Wireshark.
Yeah, and actually the story does start in Italy, in Piemonte, where I grew up at Politecnico di Torino. And actually my early and initial contribution to Wireshark was a way to collect network traffic. So to plug your computer, there were not even laptops at the time, it was desktops, but to take a network cable and connect it to the network and being able to start extracting traffic from the network so that you could observe what your computer and the other computers collected to the network were doing, which packets, which data. That technology was available only through commercial tools at that point. So you had to spend tens of thousands of dollars on a real physical piece of hardware to being able to analyze the traffic and the content of the data circulating on the network. And at that point, a professor at the university called Silvano Gai, which then moved to work with Cisco and had a pretty successful career there, wanted to have a network analyzer for all of the students because he believed, and they shared that belief, that the best way to learn computer networks is by observing them. Only problem, of course, as you can imagine, an Italian university did not even have close to the budget to be able to give a network analyzer to all of the students. So the professor had a sort of crazy idea to build one. And in order to build a network analyzer, the first thing that you need to do is capture the network traffic. And you need a so-called packet capture driver, which is like a piece of software that needs to run inside the operating system. And I was tasked during my graduation thesis to build a packet capture driver, which we called Win Pickup. At the same time, as we were also trying to build the network analyzer by ourselves to give to the students, we realized that this guy in Kansas City called Gerard Combs had started working on a network analyzer for Sun Solaris called Ethereal. And this thing was starting being used and adopted around. So we thought, why don't we just put together Win Pickup and Ethereal, and we make a version for Windows, because people at that point were using Windows, all over the world. So it was like Solaris was very expensive, and there was a limited number of people that had it. So that decision, made Win Pickup explode and made Ethereal explode, because finally everybody essentially had a free version that you could deploy on any Windows computer of something very expensive, but also very important when you do networking, like a network analyzer. that made us think, wow, that there must be something of value here. I was still in school. Gerald was working for an internet service provider in Kansas City, and for a while we just kept working at this tool for some years while I completed my PhD, and essentially we decided what to do. But at a certain point in 2005, we decided, why don't we start a business around this? There must be some way to make money. We're still not sure. And as you can imagine, at that point, neither of us had any kind of business expertise or even business sense, and so we just incorporated the company. At the time, by the way, I moved to Davis, to California, during my PhD, to complete my PhD actually. And I started the company together with the professor who invited me to the United States, which is another thing that was pretty amazing at that point for me. Like a professor wants to start the company with me. It's in Italy. You come from Italy as well. It's not
Yes.
it's not as normal as it is in California. And that brought to the creation of our first company, my first company, CACE Technologies. And there was a problem. We had Wind Pickup, we had Ethereal, but Ethereal, the brand, the domain name for the website, and the logo, the trademark on the logo, they were recorded by Gerald's employer, the little internet service provider in Kansas City. And of course, we didn't have the means to acquire those assets. We really started the company with zero funding. Who would have given us money? And as a consequence, we just decided, okay, let's rename Ethereal into Wireshark. This was the spring of 2006, and let's take it from there. Hopefully the community will understand why we're doing this. We're trying to build a company behind this. We want to keep supporting the community. We want to invest in open source, and we took the step, and that's how Wireshark, the name, was born. The network analyzer was already 5 years old at that point, but Wireshark, was born as a tool name in 2006. We at that point, gradually grew a business around it by making a lot of mistakes, and that business ended up growing nicely with essentially a strong open source focus and a set of products that were essentially offering functionality at the periphery of Wireshark, the network analyzer, and we pick up the packet capture library. And the company ended up being acquired around 5 years later, in 2010, by a bigger company called Riverbed. And that essentially how I concluded my first life as an entrepreneur.
Yeah,
and
your
then,
first
once
exit.
you do it once, exactly. Once you do it once, you want to do it more. So that's,
of course,
then it continues.
This is a great story. And of course, I knew most of the story, but it's always good to hear it again. And it's refreshing. Also, it's important to remind ourselves that the dates you gave us are very important. You essentially started this business in 2005, 2006. Then in 2010, so 5 years later, you were acquired by Riverbed. And this is 10 years ago. And you already, I don't want to say you pioneered, because you were not the only one. But back then, it was quite rare to see a company emerge out of an open source product and community, emerge successfully and being able to monetize successfully. And of course, I would guess that that experience gave you something very important that you then reused when you decided to start Sysdig, because we're going to talk about it in a moment. But then tell me, so 2 years later, you had your golden handcuffs with Riverbed, as they're called, meaning that when you are acquired, there is an incentive for you to stay for 1 or 2 years at least. Would they give you extra stocks or maybe extra compensation? But then after that, the transition is over and you're essentially free to venture into new opportunities or new adventures. And in 2012, you decided to start a new company. So how did you come up with the idea around Sysdig? what was the problem you wanted to solve?
Yeah, that was a little bit later than 2012, because we got acquired at the end of 2010. I stayed with Riverbed for a couple of years, and then I took a little bit of a break in the meantime. While I was at Riverbed, we essentially were acquired to become a business unit of Riverbed. To give a little bit of context, Riverbed specializes in devices for like network acceleration and WAN optimization and stuff like that. So
one is wide area network, WAN,
exactly.
for the audience.
Exactly. So these are devices that you put at the two ends of like a long internet cable that, for example, connects your data center with that. And these two devices do compression, do a bunch of stuff that allows essentially you to save money because you use less bandwidth and you have less latency. But at Riverbed, essentially, they acquired us to differentiate and to start building essentially a visibility business. And we were pretty successful at that. And it was a super fun experience because, first of all, I learned so much by being lucky enough to join a very talented team. But then we also had many more resources. So the reach and revenue of our product grew pretty successfully inside Riverbed. So from one point of view, we were taking our products that were focused on providing visibility and performance management for networks and applications sitting on top of the network by using packets, network packets, as the source of truth, right? So by looking at how the different endpoints that are connecting to a network talk to each other, you can tell a lot of stuff. You can understand the performance. You can understand if there are security issues. You can understand if somebody's attacking you. You can understand if some data has been stolen, you know? If you think about packets and network traffic just as a unit of information, it has some really, really rich and powerful properties. Packets are extremely dense in information, especially if you're able to see inside and go dissect the headers, the information, the payloads of these packets. You can really understand what data, what an application is doing. At the same time, you can do this data collection without intent, without invasiveness. What I mean is many techniques to go and introspect what's happening from the performance, from the security point of view, require you to link libraries, require you to install something, require you to do something invasive, and that requires intent, which means you need to typically tell your developers, either do this or I will be blind, you know? Network sits underneath. It's the source of truth that never lies, right? So you can just sit on the spam port of a router and get all of the data, and you know that you're not missing anything. And you know that what you're capturing has a good level of accuracy. So essentially, the value that we were bringing to the market was essentially a consequence of the richness, of the properties, of the value of this data source that we were tapping into.
Nice.
Now, only problem is that it was clear that as the world was changing, as AWS was exploding, do you know anything about that, Simone?
Yeah, a little bit.
As a little company called that was doing PaaS called .cloud was being renamed into Docker.
Well, I have one of their shirts.
Exactly,
so.
Exactly. This vintage point, this collection point was going to disappear. It was clear. You know, the spam port of the router. Where is the spam port of the router? When you are renting instances from AWS. Amazon has access to the router, not you. You know, you are getting a virtual machine. So you don't have this place where all the traffic goes through that is like your magic collection point. Where is your collection point when you're orchestrating hundreds of containers with Kubernetes on a single machine, And even if you were able to access the router, there's so much that is going on that machine internally that the data that hits the router is irrelevant. It's 1% of what you need, So clearly, deeply, architecturally, the world was changing. And I had worked in an industry and built products for the past 10 years. And clearly there was the innovation dilemma. Like we were forced to approach this problem by retrofitting existing solutions on which we had invested years and years and years of IP development, right? So it was exciting and painful at the same time. Exciting because it was clear. Every time, and this is maybe a little, nugget for the listeners if they are entrepreneurs, every time there is a tectonic shift in an industry, every time there's like a technological inflection, like cloud, like containers, like Kubernetes, like now serverless, for example, that's when people like us have an opportunity to take advantage of.
Nice.
At the same time, the painful part is that you need to, if you really want to take advantage of that opportunity, you need to just invest into it without fear and without baggage of what you were doing before. And that is painful when your baggage is your sweat, for many years before. So I knew that essentially the only way to solve this was going to be start from the beginning by myself, which is scary, but also the most exciting part, in my opinion. The most rewarding part of being an entrepreneur. That's the feeling when you're alone. You jump in a pool full of sharks and you start swimming, and you see if you survive. And the idea was essentially, okay, how do we take what we had created before, technology-wise, so the lessons that we learned by creating essentially the workflows around packets, the lessons that we learned by creating an open source network analyzer that is used by the whole planet essentially with millions of users, and can we not forget about them, but can we reapply them? What is the appropriate technological stack and architectural construct to be able to bring the same value to the new world? And that's how Sysdig started essentially, with experiments to essentially try to create a collection system that would be as powerful as packets, but would work with containers, with cloud instances, with Kubernetes, with all of this kind of stuff. And this is still essentially the fundamental architectural premise of Sysdig.
Thanks, Loris. This was a great summary of how you transitioned from being at this large corporation now, realizing that the innovator's dilemma, something is happening in the world. Amazon Web Services is just exploding like this. Containers are happening. In fact, .cloud was renamed Docker in 2013, and because they just decided to focus completely on containers, Linux containers. And this is even before Kubernetes was open sourced by Google, which happened a couple of years later. So at this point, you said, okay, I want to take the lessons I've learned from my past experience using an open source tool to provide a service to a community, nurture this community, and then eventually create a product around it that I can charge for. And that's what Sysdig did. And that's what you're still doing today, because you're still based on an open source set of tools. There's not just one now, there's multiple ones. And maybe you can give us a very quick overview, but this doesn't have to be a company pitch. Just tell us very high level, what are the 2 or 3 main products that the company does? Falco, for example, is very interesting, but give us an idea of what the company does today, 5-6 years later.
Yeah, absolutely. So at this point, based on the premise that I told you, Sysdig has grown quite a bit. And we are leaders in secure DevOps. We provide security and visibility and monitoring tools for cloud and cloud native infrastructures. We focus on the life cycle of cloud applications on the CI/CD essentially process
That's continuous integration, continuous delivery for the audience that doesn't know that acronym.
Exactly, and it's essentially the modern way of developing, shipping, building, and delivering and delivering applications that is based essentially on a continuous pipeline where your code gets committed, gets tested automatically, goes through multiple stages of validation, and then just goes in production. And this allows you essentially to bring software development productivity to much higher levels. And in order to do that, of course, this requires the right organization in the company. That requires using technologies like containers and Kubernetes and so on. But it also requires to have the proper visibility, the proper security, the proper compliance in your infrastructure. So all of this kind of stuff is stuff that Sysdig provides and offers to customers that are typically enterprise customers that want to use these technologies at scale in production.
Nice.
Now, separately, I mean, independently from more like the pitch of what the company does, from the technology point of view, the philosophy behind the technology is still very much what I described before when I was talking about the idea that sparks Sysdig. So the best data collected in the most powerful and transparent way that can be converted as a consequence to the best insight. So the differentiator for Sysdig compared to the other players in the space is being able to collect the best data with the lowest possible overhead and the lowest possible friction for the users, and with no intent, you remember the intent, so that magically you get not only the goodness of containers and Kubernetes, but also the security, the compliance, the conformance, and everything else that needs to come when you're developing production applications.
That's nice. So I think it will be interesting for the audience now to dive deeper into just one aspect of your entrepreneurial experience. We don't have time to cover all of the things that we could cover, but maybe we can pick one aspect, and one aspect in which you think you learned something very valuable. This is something worth sharing, something not obvious for the audience, something that maybe people usually underestimate or oversee. What would be this single aspect that you think you want to share, where you are old and wise? Not old, but very wise.
Old. That's, what a tough question. There are so many things, and every stage of the company is different learnings that you made. That's the beauty of being an entrepreneur. I would say if I had to talk about something interesting, and that was a big lesson for me at Sysdig, it was the period of time when you're very early, and essentially you are in that strange catch-22 situation when you don't really have anything yet, especially where I've always operated in the market of enterprise software, right? So this is not like maybe like a social network where you can adopt like the lean methodologies and have a minimum viable product in 2 months. You really need to build typically technology for months, but more likely years, before somebody can even use it. So from one point of view, you are when you're at the very early stages, you still don't have anything, and you need resources to start building your vision and your dream. At the same time, it's hard to get resources because you don't have anything, right? And that's when, for example, I was able to leverage all of the expertise that came from my previous life. So as I was mentioning before, Sysdig was essentially, we can summarize it as applying old school previous generation, let's say, instead of a school, applying previous generation success stories to the next generation. And the previous generation success stories were, number one, open source. Open source is very important for so many things, and nowadays, even in enterprise software, it's almost like you have to do open source. But open source is also a powerful brand generator for your organization. It's a powerful talent attraction tool when you're at the beginning and you need to prove that you can essentially bring on board, the best developers, the best marketing people, and so on. Open source is also a virality generator, and open source is also a way to attract investments. Especially at seed stage, there's a huge difference if you can show that you have a budding community versus just a slide deck. And I assume as an investor, Simone, you appreciate that. That becomes essentially the portfolio for a very, very early company, and one of the few things that an investor can essentially trust in the company. And so we sort of, with Sysdig, with Wireshark, we had the open source for a long time before we essentially realized, okay, we can build a business on this. With Sysdig, we were a little bit more like, explicit in our strategy about this, and we started building something that essentially could be the new packet capture, essentially, for containers and for Kubernetes. So we took a pain that was very clear in the previous generation and that we knew how to solve very well, and we essentially engineered a solution, essentially going for not certainty that it would be adopted, but almost because we knew that the pain was there, essentially because we spent 10 years essentially dealing with people that had that pain. And then we engineered the solution, first of all, to solve the pain, because if you don't bring value, it doesn't matter if it's free. There's still people won't adopt you, So, but at the same time, we also crafted it in a way that initially would generate virality, that a developer, a sysadmin, a DevOps would say, wow, this is cool. I want to try. I want to read more about that, And this is what was a little bit more like a explicit optimization for, let's call it, Hacker News from page. It's not. It's diminishing to say it's only Hacker News from page, but we put together a tool that would be, from one point of view, useful, but would have nuggets of being exciting. Like you could tweak into it with Lua, the Lua programming language, or you could. It was tied to the Linux kernel operating system, which is always something that a nerd like me likes reading about, and we really created a little bit of a recipe that not only would be useful, but would be like, okay, if I see it on Hacker News, I want to learn more. I want to try to install it, and I want to see what it does. And it's interesting how writing open source code can be marketing, and can be approached like go to market. And it's one of the beautiful things about code. It's a language, and it can be used for just, like solving a technical problem, but also to speak, to your target audience. And our target audience was sysadmins and developers and so on. And then we went through really like the exercise of doing like a launch campaign that would be something like a product launch campaign, but for an open source tool, not for something that we would sell. But we started engaging influencers in the space months before we decided to launch, our first open source tool. We started joining groups. We started giving the tool as a preview to people that we knew could blog about it or doing something like that, to make them, give them importance and relevance, and in exchange, essentially get a coverage and visibility from them. And then, of course, we started, our campaign for Reddit and for that kind of stuff, synchronized for a specific day. when we did our launch. And of course, we do it. And first time we try doesn't go the way you want. So you try again. And the first time we really went viral. And that's what essentially allows us to raise our Series A and what brought the pipeline of users that then became, the first users of our commercial tool, and instructed our roadmap and allowed us to collect feedback, and the rest is history,
Yeah.
But we started by essentially taking advantage of our old generation knowledge and really meaningfully utilize open source as a tool to bootstrap the company and resolve essentially the lack, the world doesn't know who you are, problem that every company has at the beginning.
Yeah, that's very nice. In fact, I think you touched on a few important points. Number one, you already had a playbook that you used in your previous company that you thought it could still be relevant, although applied to a new landscape, to the world of containers, the world of Amazon Web Services, and then later the other cloud computing companies trying to catch up with the meteoric rise of AWS, but also back then using an open core approach in a way, where you have an open source core, but then you add features that are proprietary and that you charge for, was essentially still untested, or at least very uncertain in terms of not just go to market, but more importantly in terms of fundraising. There were not a lot of funds, a lot of VCs that completely understood the potential of being able to do that. And of course, you rode the momentum of containers, 2013, 2014, Docker and containers were all the rage. And if you had anything to do with developers, with system administrators, if you were a tech guy or a geek, or if you were reading Hacker News every day, which is something I still do today.
Me too.
So you would have heard of containers. You would have heard of this new wave of technology, but still, in that period of time, I know it's only 6-7 years ago, but in that period of time, it was still quite hard to be able to create a company out of this, and not a lot of them succeeded. In fact, now it seems almost trivial to do that. And, it's trivial to think, of course, this is how you do it. There's nothing new, nothing special about it. But back then, it was not obvious at all. And it was not easy at all to be able to do it. Then I think this leads us to another question I had for you, which is related to a more recent period. So you did this. You managed to create a community around it. You managed to launch it successfully and then raise a Series A. And then you raise a Series B, etc. So let's go to 2018. So 2.5 years ago now, early 2018, when you are still the CEO and, if I'm not mistaken, also the CTO of the company. And then you realize, I have too much on my plate. The company is growing too much. I feel a bit uncomfortable in being able to manage the growth of this company. And you decided to do something not completely obvious. So tell us about what you did there. What happened?
Yeah, I mean, the short single sentence answer is I brought a partner on board who became the CEO of the company. And essentially, I stepped down from the role, and I became, and I still am, the CTO of the company. The longer way to talk about this is there are typically people that optimize their contributions to different stages of a company. For the vast majority of the startups, that's not a problem because the mortality rate is relatively high. So at the beginning, you optimize with somebody like me, who's the creative, technical founder who can at the same time, work on product market fit and build a product, because I did both, especially at the very beginning. And that kind of profile, so I consider myself a good engineer, not the best in the world. A good product manager, not the best in the world. a decent CEO, not the best in the world. A decent marketing guy, not the best in the world. So if you put me at the top of any of these functions, there are many people in the world that do this better than me. What I bring to the table is there are not a lot of people that can be operationally capable and functional at all of this level. And that's the summary in sales, of course. I forgot to say sales, which is the most important thing.
Yeah, that's also part of being a CEO, to be completely fair. So you're not a good CEO if you're not able to sell your product.
Exactly. So for a few years, I think that a profile like mine is the ideal profile for being an entrepreneur. And anybody listening that wants to be an entrepreneur, you need to essentially realize you and your co-founder need to be good enough at anything that I listed. Otherwise, don't do it. You're just going to cause pain to yourself. I draw enjoyment from any of these things. For example, I was very surprised when I found that I actually enjoy sales, But clearly, I think that when our organization crossed the 100 people, or was around the 100 people range, I think that Suresh joined when we were like 95 people, and we were, in that phase where you're sort of at the transition between the millions and the tens of millions of revenue, maybe not yet, but that's the level where essentially you go from bootstrapping something into having a business, having a real organization. And at that point, there are different mechanics that play a role here. And I'm not saying people cannot do both. I'm saying I realize I personally cannot do both. And I think that probably the best and luckiest choice that I've done as an entrepreneur has been bringing on board the right person that essentially has become a partner with me with this. This person now, is driving growth at Sysdig with at a level that I would not be able to. At the same time, I am able to focus on the technology and the technological direction of the company, not having to worry about sales, about budget, about everything else, because I know there's a person that can be trusted 100% to do that. Nice. That increased my quality of life, but I also strongly believe that it's something that is increasing, and we'll see what happens with Sysdig, but it's definitely increased the chances of success, of big success for Sysdig dramatically. And one of the hard things to do when the company is your baby is putting it in somebody else's hands. And but for the technical founder, I think this is a transition that is common, and I would say not necessary, but something that really, really helps.
Nice. And this is, of course, a very important point, because sometimes ego, pride, there is a number of not positive emotions or feelings that get in the way of you taking the right decision. And I don't know specifically about your experience, but for example, I've been in a situation where I had to essentially decide to step down as CEO of the company I created, so my baby. And I thought this is actually the right decision for the company and for the investors and for the other people in the company. And ultimately, I think I did the right thing. But I felt in that moment how hard it was to somehow question yourself, to even ask yourself, could I have done it differently? Could I have done something in a different way that would have avoided this particular fate? But then in your case, as far as I know from the outside, it was a relatively happy and peaceful transition for you. It was more of, I want this company to grow faster, to grow bigger. And I realized that I'm not enjoying it as much as I used to, because you cross the 100 people threshold. You start to have to deal with a lot of overhead in managing people, in managing performance, not of the network, but of the people under you. And at that point, you brought in a seasoned executive that exactly knew how to take this little jewel and make it grow even bigger than that. And I've been observing it from the outside. I think it has been a very good and nice transition. In fact, just before the weird events of 2020 started to unfold, I think in January this year, if I'm not mistaken, you raised your latest round, bringing a total of funding to $191 million.
I think the correct number is 206.
Okay, so I was missing 15 million, so apologies for that. So you raised so far more than $200 million with Sysdig. And now, can you give us a ballpark figure of how many people work for Sysdig right now?
Yeah, Sysdig is around 250 people.
Nice.
And at this point, we are a pretty global organization with not only sales, but also R&D and marketing offices across the globe, including Serbia, Italy, Spain, North Carolina, San Francisco, India, and some that I'm definitely not remembering now.
Yeah, nice.
Companies definitely grown pretty nicely, including during this tough year of COVID. So we're
Nice.
pretty pleased about it.
In fact, I have two questions here for you. One is about what do you think happened to your company, but also to companies operating in your space with the advent of COVID. And then the second will be about where we're going from a technical perspective. But let's focus on this one first. So we are now in September 2020, even though this episode might be published in a few weeks, not immediately. But for context for the audience, we're now essentially 6 months into COVID, at least in the US. So what do you think has been the biggest impact on your business, on your specific area, not just for Sysdig, but for companies operating in your space?
So first I want to do a caveat, which is I still don't know what will happen and that happening with COVID. We are not out of it at all yet. So I don't want to say something that I will have to regret having said, maybe 3 months from now. But what I've seen in our industry, and I think in the economy, in the general economy at large, is there's been a time right away, like in the spring, March, April, when people, the lockdowns started, and people realized the seriousness of this, which coincides to when the stock market collapsed. At that point, everything froze. All of the budgets were frozen, and nothing was moving for anybody. But that didn't last super long. Quite quickly. In a general way, anything related to digital started one way or another booming, right? And we saw that as a reflection of the stock market. We saw that as like the incredible buzz generated by the visible winners there, like the Zooms of the world or the Netflix of the world. But in a general way, everybody, even like the old brick and mortar businesses, even the mom and pop restaurant or little shop, they had to move to digital. Schools have to move to digital. You are at home, and you order online. You much more now. You use digital services much more, right? So anything that is related to online, to web, and in particular bleeding edge industries like the one where we operate, the Kubernetes, Docker containers, cloud, and so on, those immediately become not only elements of recovery in the economy, but elements of strength, where immediately everybody realizes that they need to invest more in that. So from that point of view, I feel like our industry, so Sysdig specifically, but our industry as large, is seeing not a strong slowdown, but almost a little bit of an acceleration, caused by just stronger investments in moving to the cloud, in moving to CI/CD, to microservices, to all of these things that are essentially the components of competing strongly in the digital world. And how will this pan out? Will this be permanent? It's hard to tell, but it's also interesting because I do believe that COVID is accelerating a set of behaviors in normal people, like purchasing online, like having stuff delivered at home, like whatever, doing your banking from your computer instead of especially if you're maybe an older person going to the branch of your Bank of America, like participating in Zoom calls or WhatsApp conversations with your friends more, even if you're older. So I do believe that there will be some permanent behavioral change in society that will drive the society more and more into, let's call it, towards software and toward the cloud.
Nice.
I think anybody, especially in Silicon Valley, is or will be positioning themselves according to these trends.
Yeah, makes sense. So speaking of this technology, as I mentioned earlier, we can probably agree that in 2020, containers, Kubernetes, and all the ecosystem around it is now considered to be mainstream. It's no longer a niche product or a niche technology. It is now being used in production. It is growing fast, even though there's still way to go before they manage all workloads in the world. But this is now a moment of maturing technology. I think I'm very interested in hearing from you, given your point of view, your vantage point. What do you think is the most interesting trend that we're going to observe in the next 2 or 3 years from a purely technology standpoint? What's going to happen, or what's already started to happen that you think is worth mentioning and worth taking a look at?
Yeah, so I'm going to stay within my backyard because I feel like if I should make predictions, they should be in a domain that at least I understand and I operate within. So I would start from what I was saying before. So the trend toward digital and trend, and in any particular trend toward cloud. It's at this point a very established and ongoing trend, but I think it will accelerate both just in terms of adoption. So we will soon see, even in traditional enterprises and businesses, cloud to be the default way to run your software and your applications. rather than maybe, hybrid and having, your own data center and so on. So the transition will be both in terms of like just direction where you run the workloads, but also how you run your workloads, because you can run your workloads in the cloud by just renting virtual machines from a cloud provider, but largely, essentially, still adopting software development and software deployment philosophies that are like, let's say, more traditional. And then there's cloud native, what's called cloud native, which is really using architectures like the ones that have been publicized by Google and Netflix and so on. So service-oriented architectures, use of containers, departure from thinking about machines, virtual or physical, and just think about applications and teams, and just orchestrating software, use of serverless, use of orchestrators like Kubernetes, use of frameworks like, for example, Lambda on AWS that allows you to just have functions that are executed, not even full pieces of software. So we will see more and more an evolution toward using cloud in a cloud native way, even by traditional teams, and that will really become the default. And from this perspective, in my opinion, something like Kubernetes is and will be the operating system of the cloud. 20 years ago, we always talk about the VM revolution, right? VMware, who essentially went from the physical servers to the virtual servers, around 20 years ago. And that is a big revolution. But in my opinion, during those years, an even more important revolution happened, which is the Linux one, right? We went from stacks of software built on commercial vendor-provided components into more and more adopting free stacks based on open source, and that took time, but generated the rise of companies like Red Hat and all of the providers of open source. And really, at this point, 20 years later, Linux is the common, essentially, engine that runs all of your applications. More and more, and even Microsoft has to adapt to it. 5 years from now, 10 years from now, Kubernetes will be the engine that runs your applications and distributes them in the cloud. Linux has a scheduler that organizes processes on a physical machine. Kubernetes has a scheduler that organizes containers in the cloud or in multiple clouds, maybe. Linux is, the concept of users and the login. Kubernetes is the concept of RBAC for users. So all of the primitives that caused the Linux revolution are just taken and applied to a distributed multi-machine, multi-cloud, multi-application world, and they will become essentially the way you build everything. So as Linux now is the default alternative accepted by everybody to run everything, Kubernetes will be the same in 5 years from now. And at that point, Fargate, Lambda, GKE, EC2, all of these ways where you can that you can run your applications will just be irrelevant because you use the same operating system. That's what.
And what do you think is the biggest challenge from a technical perspective for Kubernetes to become this mainstream? Is it storage? Is it networking? Is it security? What is it?
It is a bunch of everything, like for Linux. You need to harden it and make it production ready, and it requires all of the above. In particular, Sysdig as a company and as an open source organization focuses on the visibility and security. When you're running a server, the first thing that you need to make sure is that when somebody's stealing your data, and you protect the network and stuff like that, right?
Yes.
So that's basic. There are industries, huge industries on this stuff. We at Sysdig focus on that. The other thing that you need to know is how your server is performing, right? And now you don't have a server anymore. You have essentially orchestrated containers, but still the same. And Sysdig focuses on that. So the answer to your question is all of the above. But in my opinion, since I'm putting my money where security and just managing performance are two really, really key important ones where Sysdig is a leading vendor.
Nice. And one more question on serverless. Personally, I think a lot of people confuse the ultimate goal of serverless with what used to be platform as a service. Companies like Heroku and such, where you write your code, you deploy your code, and then the platform as a service runs that code for you. You don't need to arrange for pretty much anything. Where serverless is more about functions, is more about a different paradigm, if you will. And the two might even coexist in a way. Besides Kubernetes, which is, we can call it the infrastructure that powers your applications on top of it, what do you think is going to happen at the application layer in terms of development, but also in terms of how teams will eventually deploy, redeploy, upgrade their applications? How do you think serverless is going to evolve? Do you think that platform as a service is going to have a comeback? What's your view on that particular front?
I don't think I am equipped to give you a definitive answer on this, because I think this is an area where history is being written as we speak. To give you an example, a big focus at Sysdig right now is what does it even mean to have runtime security for something like Fargate, for example, where you just have a container that is orchestrated somewhere by Amazon. And right now, when we say serverless, we mean things that are pretty different, because like Fargate that I just mentioned is really like Amazon just runs these containers for you, while Lambda is much more granular, and you write a Python or like a Perl function, and Amazon will just run this function specifically. What's interesting is that under the hood, architecturally, the things are pretty similar.
Yep.
But at the same time, what something like runtime security means, it's not completely clear yet. You know that your software will be running on top of these platforms, executed by a third-party entity, a cloud provider. So you know that security not only remains a concern, but it's even more of a concern. But how to protect them is something that, for example, it's interesting because we are right now approaching it both from the commercial point of view, Sysdig, and from the open source point of view with Falco, our runtime security tool. This is another open source project that we have. And it's really like almost like a work that we are doing and we have to do in cooperation with Amazon to come up essentially with the right primitives and the right approaches to this to understand, I cannot really gather maybe enough information through the usual means, to make sure that no one is stealing the data of my user. So how do we work together as a community, Amazon and as vendors, to essentially make it something that can be done in the future, So how will this evolve? How will application be run? How will we protect them? How we will make sure our data is not stolen? I think it's a big, very interesting, exciting work in progress, and it's one of those inflections where it's cool to be an entrepreneur. So again, for the listeners, this is an area where if you are creative and smart, you can generate success.
Nice, thank you. So Loris, I think we are pretty much at the end of our podcast for today. Any parting thoughts? Any last comment you want to give the audience before we say goodbye?
No, not really. Other than as an entrepreneur, it's a tiring and painful journey, but I would do it again any day. And I really recommend anybody to try it, because it's the most exciting thing that you can do in your life.
Nice. Thank you very much, Loris. And thank you for listening. Goodbye, everyone.